Good day. Today is Sunday, 16th November 2025, and before I start this program, let me again remind you to tick the like button if once you've watched the video or whatever part of the video you want to watch, you've liked what you've heard, and you want to indicate that fact. Now, today I'm going to start with news that's coming from Belgium, from Euroclear, the famous European depository, where a large proportion of the Russian central bank's frozen reserves are located. And over the last few hours, the last 24 hours, the chief executive officer of Euroclear, Valérie Urbain, has made a number of statements which make clear, for me at least, where the objections to from the Belgian government against the European plan for a loan treating Russian assets in Euroclear as collateral, where those plans are coming, where those objections within Belgium are coming from. So Valérie Urbain has made a number of comments, and I'm going to summarize them as follows. Firstly, misappropriating the Russian assets in Euroclear would effectively amount to theft. Secondly, doing such a thing would be inconceivable and unthinkable and would in effect be illegal. Thirdly, that Euroclear is extremely alarmed about the effect on its own reputation if any such step were made. Fourthly, that Euroclear has already been contacted by clients from around the world. She mentioned Asia and the Middle East, all of them anxious about the discussions concerning the potential seizure or confiscation or misappropriation of the Russian central bank's frozen assets. And Euroclear has been trying to reassure them. And lastly, that Euroclear not only opposes such steps, but is considering legal action in the event that the European Commission and European governments were to decide to take this step of confiscating, misappropriating, doing various illegal things with the Russian frozen assets, which Euroclear considers to be both illegal and disastrous. So it does not automatically follow that Euroclear would comply with an instruction to have the assets misappropriated in the way that has been suggested and which might be done. So these are pretty strong words. And I would just add something else. I saw a commentary about Valérie Urbain's words in which it mentioned that the total amount of the funds deposited in Euroclear, not by the Russians, but by all the various depositors, the central banks and other agencies that deposit funds in Euroclear, that the total amount of these amount to something like 40 trillion euros. The 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets is a minuscule part of the amount in total on deposit. The point is that if the holders of these funds were to start to worry that Euroclear itself was unsafe and start to withdraw their assets and funds from Euroclear, well, given that we're talking about 40 trillion dollars or euros of deposits, one could see how that could have a catastrophic impact on the EU's entire economy, given that I suspect that that figure of 40 trillion significantly exceeds the total amount of Europe's GDP. Just saying. Now, in saying that, one must make a number of immediate qualifications. Firstly, I don't know that this figure of 40 trillion euros is actually true. That's the first thing to say. But I suspect it probably is. It feels to me as if it could be. Secondly, it is likely that a large proportion of that 40 trillion, perhaps the bulk of it, is made up of funds and assets deposited with Euroclear by Western financial institutions, Western central banks, Western public institutions and companies, perhaps, for all I know, international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. I don't know for a fact that they have funds with Euroclear, but I would not be surprised if they did. And more likely than not, if there was some misappropriation of Russian funds, well, all of that money, which I am guessing accounts for the greater part of the money and assets on deposit with Euroclear, would stay put. But if there was a significant withdrawal of funds, say 1 or 2 trillion euros, seems astonishing to talk about that, from Euroclear, well, I can very easily see how that would create a crisis and a cascade effect on the whole system. I'm not saying categorically that it would, but I can see why Valérie Urbain and the government of Belgium, which clearly would not have the resources to stabilize Euroclear. I mean, we're talking about an institution far bigger in terms of its financial reach than the government of Belgium, the state of Belgium. I can very well understand why they would be so nervous with what is being proposed. And given also how big Euroclear is, it becomes entirely understandable why the governments of the other European states are very, very wary of taking any step at all that might be seen to be giving Euroclear a backstop, going beyond the backstop that the Belgian government has been would be obliged to provide. So that is an interesting development. Now, in any normal world, in any rational world, that would be the end of the matter. But of course it won't be. The European Commission continues obsessively to seek ways of using these frozen Russian assets in order to try to fund Ukraine. I am going to say this. I come to the view, in light of what Valérie Urbain is saying, that the capital of the Russian central bank's funds held in Euroclear is indeed intact, and that what the European governments have been working with has indeed been the interest produced by those assets in Euroclear. Now, however, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has rightly pointed out, the amount of interest that the assets in Euroclear are generating is not enough to cover all of the financial obligations that it seems to me have already been made on the strength of the interest that these assets have supposedly been generating. So I'm going to make a guess that what has been happening is that quietly European governments and the European Commission have been quietly appropriating various frozen Russian assets that have been lying around in Europe outside Euroclear and which have not been protected by Euroclear in the same way. So by now, I suspect that what has happened is that the European Commission and European governments have run through all of these assets. Some say, I've seen a figure of 80 billion euros in assets, Russian frozen assets, mostly government assets, but also quite plausibly some assets of some private individuals as well. That European governments and the European Commission have quietly already used up all of those, and that is how the figures have been squared, but that so far it has indeed been the case that they have not dared up to now to touch the capital in Euroclear. Now, with all of the frozen Russian assets lying around Europe, which were not in Euroclear, already used up, and the interest that the Euroclear assets are generating no longer efficient. This is why the European Commission and some European governments, including the Merz government in Germany, have started to look at the remaining Russian assets in Euroclear. And this is the precipitating event in this crisis. Now, the alternative, as the European Commission says, given that funding from the EU budget for Ukraine is apparently no longer possible, the alternative would be for European governments themselves to increase the level of funding for Ukraine beyond what they have already been doing. Germany, Friedrich Merz, his government, has already done that to the tune of 3 billion euros for next year. But that, of course, will be nowhere close to being enough. The other European governments, for the moment, are balking at doing so. And even in terms of the German government, that is, in effect, a rounding up error. 3 billion additional euros is not going to come anywhere close for meeting the financial needs of Ukraine, which is spending through its budget more than, as I understand it, more than twice the amount it receives in taxes from whatever part of the economy the Ukrainian economy continues to function, and whose financial needs continue to grow and swell as its deficit continues to grow and swell. So we can begin to see the extent of the crisis. Now, I'm going to, before saying a few more things about where this leaves the crisis in Ukraine, I want to say something here about Valery Urban. Now, I've seen a narrative that has begun to take shape, which says that the leaders of Europe, people like Keir Starmer in London, Ursula von der Leyen in the European Commission, presumably Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron in Germany and France, that they're not really politicians at all, but technocrats. And there's actually an article in Unheard by Aris Rousinos, a journalist, by the way, for whom I have a very, very high degree of respect, who refers to Keir Starmer as the last of the technocrats. I don't think that any of these people can be described properly as technocrats. Technocrats are the indispensable experts, the people who have the technical knowledge, who are found within all important governments and public institutions, who know how to make things work and who know how to pull the levers to get things done. Mostly, in many places, they are engineers. In financial institutions, they are financial experts. Valery Urban is a technocrat. Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, despite sometimes pretenses that he is, Friedrich Merz, are not. In my opinion, these people are better described as functionaries, members of the European political apparatus. If I can just say, a colleague of Aris Roussinos on Unheard, Thomas Farsi, describes them much better. They absolutely lack the kind of technical competence and understanding of the mechanics that someone like Valery Urban has, which is why they come up with mad schemes like the attempts to mismanage the Russian assets in the way that they do. Anyway, that is one thing I want to say. There is another thing I want to say, which is about the way in which the financial crisis, the funding crisis for Ukraine, probably is already impacting on the situation in Kiev itself. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the motivations behind the current crisis, corruption crisis in Kiev. The former Ukrainian Prime Minister, Nikolai Azarov, who has worked as Prime Minister of Ukraine, successfully, by the way, during the time of President Yanukovych, and who is now in exile in Russia, and who was, as I remember, whilst he was Prime Minister of Ukraine, actually quite widely respected. Anyway, he has seen the corruption scandal that is playing out in Kiev as part of an attempt by the United States to remove Vladimir Zelensky from the scene. The Americans are becoming increasingly frustrated by Zelensky's total intransigence. The meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky that took place in October, the meeting which took place directly after Trump's long telephone call with Putin, the telephone call in which Putin warned him against deploying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, and over the course of which Trump offered and suggested a summit meeting between himself and Putin in Budapest. Anyway, that meeting between Zelensky and Trump was supposedly the final straw. And in fact, I'm now hearing reports both from Russian and American sources, and I want to be very careful what I say here because I don't want to cause anybody any trouble. But anyway, I'm hearing reports that the meeting between Trump and Zelensky went horribly wrong and not according to plan, in the sense that after the telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, there was an understanding on the part of some officials within the US government that Trump would speak with Zelensky and would tell Zelensky that the end point in the conflict had been reached, that it was time to move forward with the understanding that Trump and Putin had reached at the summit in Alaska, in Anchorage, and that the Americans wanted Ukraine to accept the Russian conditions, to accept Istanbul Plus, and in return to get a temporary ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, but to pull out from Donbass. And then, apparently, to the surprise of some officials both in Washington and Moscow, over the course of a tense and acrimonious discussion between Trump and Zelensky, it became clear to Trump that Zelensky was immovable, and to the dismay and astonishment of some officials, it was Trump rather than Zelensky who at that point backed down. That was the final moment when Trump went back on his agreement with Putin, the agreement he reached at Anchorage, and went over entirely to Zelensky's position that instead there should be a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, and only then should negotiations of any sort begin, and that there should be, in effect, a freeze of the conflict, as urged by General Kellogg, Marco Rubio, and all of the others. And that the decisions, the American decision to call off the summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest, was not because of tense discussions between Marco Rubio and Lavrov, and between an American anger over a memorandum that the Russian Foreign Ministry sent to the Americans, but because the Americans did not know how to explain to Putin in person the extent of the U-turn that Trump had made over the course of his conversation with Zelensky. Now, I want to stress I wasn't present at that conversation. I don't know that this is really so. Zelensky has spoken as if it was so. And of course, Trump has in effect confirmed this. The Russians are, as I've discussed many times, furious about the whole affair. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, has been talking about this again today. He says that the Ukrainians know perfectly well what Putin and Trump agreed with each other in Anchorage, and so do European governments, that it was all communicated to them, and the Russians know that for a fact. Again, I don't know what information Ushakov has. I'm not going to speculate about any of this. But anyway, the argument that essentially people like Azarov are making is that the Americans are now basically reconsidering the position all over again, and that after the sudden deterioration of the situation of the battlefronts, understanding that the narrative about the war being in stalemate, that they were sold, or that Trump was sold by Zelensky and his American allies, Kellogg, Waltz, perhaps Rubio, probably others, over the last few weeks, was wrong. The Americans have decided that the moment has come to deal with Zelensky, to get him out of the way, to try to find another Ukrainian leader who will take his place so that the understanding between Putin and Trump reached in Anchorage can be finally put back on track. And that this explains the sudden or the apparently sudden activation of the corruption investigation in Kiev, that NABU and SAPO, which were set up by the United States and which are supposedly under American control, were activated and brought these corruption allegations precisely with the intention of undermining Zelensky himself and of causing a change in the regime in Kiev, bringing someone else into place who can then lead Ukraine along the path that Trump has outlined towards agreeing to Istanbul Plus in accordance with the understandings reached by Trump and Putin in Anchorage. I've set this out in detail because I get the sense that this is becoming a widespread view, and now that Azarov has expressed it, I'm also going to guess that it's going to become even more widespread, and it is often discussed, by the way, on the Russian part of the internet, and I believe, though I haven't seen this anywhere, on the Ukrainian side of the internet as well. I don't myself believe this. I think that these investigations, the corruption investigations in Kiev, have a long backstory. They probably go back at least to early summer. In other words, well before the Anchorage summit. I believe, moreover, that Nabu and Sapo, even though they might have been originally set up by the United States following the Maidan coup, and might indeed for a long time have been run mostly by the US Embassy in Kiev, are today more under European influence than American influence. And I already expressed my view that I think it would still be an enormously complicated and difficult operation to oust Zelensky. He still has the support of the security forces, the SBU, and others, and probably he also has the support of the various nationalist brigades. And besides, I don't believe that either the Americans or the leaders of the political class in Kiev want to risk the destabilization, the political destabilization of Ukraine that Zelensky's ouster might cause. And I also don't believe that there is any political figure in Kiev who, if placed in Zelensky's post, would not continue the same policies that Zelensky himself has been following. But I do think it is highly likely that these investigations that have been launched against corrupt members of Zelensky's circle are connected with the financial crisis, the funding crisis, I should say, for Ukraine that is currently playing out in Europe. There is, I suspect, a growing sense in Ukraine and amongst Ukraine's European backers that the money flow is about to reduce. It will never entirely stop. There is therefore some need to streamline the operation. There is also some need to put in place new people who perhaps feel that it's time that they had their share or their cut, and that the events in Kiev, the corruption crisis in Kiev, are indeed connected, strongly connected, with the crisis that is currently playing out in Brussels as the European Union and European governments struggle to come up with sources of funding for Ukraine itself. Anyway, that's what I think. I just want to set it all out there. This is an important story, one that should not be overlooked. I go back to what my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has pointed out, well, for several years now, but perhaps increasingly over the last year, which is that Ukraine, Project Ukraine, I stress Project Ukraine, something which should be clearly distinguished from the nation and state of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, who are not, of course, a project, but Project Ukraine, the project that the neocons and their European allies launched. That project, as Alex Christoforou has often said, has always had about it a major quality of a grift and, of course, interruptions or adjustments to the funding supply will inevitably, therefore, reflect themselves in some of the expressions, the public expressions of that grift. And that, in my opinion, is precisely what we're now seeing in playing out at the moment in Kiev. Now, since I've mentioned Donald Trump at this point, I think that I want to just say a few more things about where he stands at the moment. Because over the last 36 hours, he has had what I can only describe as a kind of meltdown. He is turning on people who used to be in the United States his staunchest, his loyalist supporters, the same people who enabled him ultimately to win his various political and legal battles during his years in the wilderness after the 2020 election, and who were instrumental in bringing him back to the presidency again. He has written astonishing comments about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Thomas Massie. He has also, of course, been increasingly critical, and indeed abusively critical, of the commentator Tucker Carlson. He said extraordinary things about Senator Rand Paul. He is obviously becoming increasingly isolated and seems to be taking steps to make himself more isolated still. And there is no doubt at all that the proximate cause of this, and in fact a large part of the cause of this, is indeed the controversy over the Epstein files, which of course he currently refers to as a hoax, which is going to upset and alarm and anger many people, many of his own supporters, even more. If it really is a hoax, by the way, which, by the way, I should make clear, I don't for a moment think, then perhaps Trump himself ought to remember that it is a hoax that he himself gave life to, because of course it was he who repeatedly promised before the election that brought him back to the presidency, that he would make full disclosure of the entire document file. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss that aspect of it, but again, I get the sense that we are drifting into some kind of conflict in Venezuela. Yesterday, or maybe it was the day before yesterday, the war secretary, I suppose we must now call him, Pete Hegseth, spoke about how the US military is about to launch some kind of grand anti-drugs operation. It was even given its own name, which, by the way, I've forgotten. All of which looks clear to me as indicating some kind of an attack on Venezuela. We've had Trump's own comments about this. We've had Trump's reversal or walk back of his agreement in Anchorage with Putin. And now we see Trump turning on the most loyal and staunch part of his base, who in turn are now disillusioned and distancing themselves from him. I have to say this. With Trump, one can never be completely sure. He has had an extraordinary ability to come to the point of total self-destruction and then find his way back. But this time, the level of self-destruction is so great that I cannot see how he can find his way back. And going back to the speculation that there is some plan underway now to remove Zelensky and to use the corruption investigation to that end, and to put someone in place who can then act upon and bring to fruition the understanding that Trump and Zelensky achieved in Anchorage. It seems to me that quite apart from the difficulties of conducting such an operation in Kiev itself, I don't believe that Trump any longer has the political capital or the authority in Washington to carry out an operation of that kind, or the control of people on the ground in Nabu and Zaporozhye and in the US Embassy in Kiev and in the bureaucracy in Washington to achieve that. Just saying. So anyway, I've discussed this at length, but I think that, as I said, this is, in some respects, as important a story as the military developments themselves are. And it is to these that I will now turn, because we've had more dramatic news. Every day now brings dramatic news, but more dramatic news over the last 24 hours. And I am going to start today with the situation in Zaporozhye region, because the Russian Defense Ministry has now said that units of the Dnieper group of forces completed the liberation of Malaya Tokmachka in Zaporozhye region. Malaya Tokmachka is located just southeast of the important town of Orekhov. When the Russian Defense Ministry says that this very important village has been captured, and by the way, it's one of the villages that was used as a launching pad for Ukraine's own disastrous summer 2023 offensive. This is an important village. But when the Russian Defense Ministry says that the entirety of this village has been captured, I assume that they also refer to the prison complex, just to the south of this village, which was a major fortified position that the Ukrainians had created in this area. So that positions the Russians much closer to Orekhov. If you look at a map of Orekhov in Zaporozhye region, you can see that Malaya Tokmachka is located very close. And it also places the Russians in positions east of Orekhov, which in some respects put the Russians very well positioned in order to combine or to unite with their forces advancing from the east, the forces that will soon, presumably, be conducting an attack on Guiliapole. Now, there's been a lot of news about the situation around Guiliapole. It is not an exaggeration to talk about a collapse of Ukrainian troops in precisely this area. There are reports that more villages immediately to the east of Guiliapole have been falling one after another. Yesterday, the Russians claimed, or rather confirmed, that they have captured a village called Yablokovo. This morning, they also claimed, or rather confirmed, that they have captured another important village called Rivnopil, a village which, by the way, the Ukrainians themselves admitted that they had abandoned a few days before. And if you now look at a map of Guiliapole and where the Russians are there, both along the road to the north of Guiliapole, the supply road to the north of Guiliapole, well, what you quickly see is that the situation around Guiliapole is starting to resemble that famous painting of the Great Wave by the Japanese painter Hokusai. It's as if the Russians, who are now both to the south and east and north of Guiliapole, are about to crash from multiple directions on Guiliapole, in effect submerging it. And I mentioned yesterday in my program that there are reports that the Ukrainians are evacuating civilians from Guiliapole. And there was a report this morning, which, by the way, I place little reliance upon. But there was a report this morning that the Ukrainian military, now recognizing how dangerous the situation in Guiliapole has become, is actually seriously considering abandoning the village itself, the town itself. That, in other words, the Russians will be able to drive into Guiliapole and capture this important and historic town without a battle. I want to stress again, I don't believe that. I do believe that the Ukrainians are indeed going to try to defend Guiliapole to the extent that they can. But the accelerating collapse of the Ukrainians makes it easy to understand why people might be speculating about this. Now, let me go back to discussing the situation with the village of Malaya Tokmachka, because Malaya Tokmachka lies, as I said, to the southeast of Orechov, along a made road, by the way, which the Russians have now cut. But Russian control of Malaya Tokmachka, if the Russians are able to broaden their control and consolidate their control of Malaya Tokmachka, in theory, puts the Russians in a position where they can advance northwards, cutting the main supply road to Guiliapole from the west. So the Russians have already cut the main supply road to Guiliapole from the north. There is the remaining supply road to Guiliapole from the west. The Russians now, at least in theory, can use Malaya Tokmachka to advance northward to cut that supply road as well. If this happens, then Malaya Tokmachka is in effect surrounded. We are indeed talking about a cauldron. I don't know how great the threat is. I would be very surprised if the Russians aren't at least considering these ideas. Perhaps their focus on capturing Malaya Tokmachka relates to all of this, is connected to all of this. Well, in light of all of that, who knows, maybe the reports that the Ukrainians now understand that Guiliapole is indeed lost and are preparing to retreat from it. Perhaps those reports might contain some grain of truth. Anyway, further north, the Russians are now apparently in the process of attacking another village to the north of Danilivka called Andreevka, and there are also other reports that the Russians are closing in on the village, actually it's a small town of Pokrovsk in precisely this area, the same territory, and that they are in the process of storming the large village or small town, perhaps more correctly, of Velika Mikhailovka. And further north still, there's a cluster of Ukrainian complaints now, bitter complaints now, about the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Dnipropetrovsk region, in Novopavlivka. And, well, I have to say this, it's increasingly starting to look as if the Russian advance eastwards, right up to the river itself, and perhaps to the cities of Pavlograd, Dnipro, and Zaporozhye, that this advance is starting to become unstoppable. This, if so, is a catastrophe. I've discussed in many programs that if Ukraine were to find the Russians establishing positions in this part of the Dnieper, close to or in actual possession of these great industrial cities, Zaporozhye and Dnipro, and indeed Pavlograd as well, which is not a small or insignificant place. If all of this really were to happen, then frankly this would be a catastrophe. It would really be the beginning of the end of Ukraine. The country would no longer be viable. And there is no real sign that the Ukrainians have any ability at the moment to stop this. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has told us a lot about what is going on in other parts of the battle lines. And I'm going to start firstly with Pokrovsk. They say that in Pokrovsk, assault detachments of the Second Army continue to eliminate encircled Ukrainian formations in the western part of the town, northwestern and eastern neighborhoods of the Centralny district, and in the western industrial area. In other words, the same areas that the fighting has been going on for some time. They say that Russian troops have been mopping up Ukrainian troops in Rivne. Rivne is this important village, community, suburb of Pokrovsk that lies between Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and which links the two. They also say, the Russians also say, that 6 attacks launched by the 425th Skala Assault Regiment from Grishino to release the encircled troops, Ukrainian troops, were repelled. And the Ukrainians have published some videos of some of these attacks. And we see these troops of the 425th Skala Assault Regiment fighting in what looks like some kind of forested area. And indeed, if you go to the maps of Pokrovsk, you will see wooded areas located to the north of Pokrovsk in various places, some of which lie, in fact, within the metropolitan boundaries of Pokrovsk. Anyway, you can see fighting taking place there. Seems to be very intense, but the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that these attempts by the 425th Skala Assault Regiment, the Special Forces Regiment of the Ukrainian Army, to break through and to establish a corridor for the Ukrainian troops who are trapped in Mirnograd, that this was unsuccessful. I suspect that the soldiers, I think there was about 3 of them, who were detected by the Russians in a building in northern Pokrovsk, which was then destroyed with the soldiers inside it, which the Russians released about a day before, that those soldiers also came from the 425th Skala Assault Regiment. Anyway, the Russians Defense Ministry also says that a unit of the Ukrainian 155th Mechanized Brigade also attempted to break out of the encirclement, but was defeated, was thwarted. So the ring around Pokrovsk continues to remain firm. That is at least what the Russians are saying, and I personally have no reason to doubt that this information is correct. There are reports that General Syrski has again transferred more troops to the Pokrovsk area, 10,000 supposedly, though I don't believe that that figure is anywhere close to being correct. The Russians, incidentally, some mapping projects are now putting the Russians closer and closer to the village of Grishino itself, so that this operational base that the Ukrainians are using to launch these attempts to break the encirclement around the Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd, mostly in Mirnograd now, that this place, Grishino, itself is now very close to being threatened by the Russians. But then I don't know the full details of this, and I am not going to discuss it further in this program. There's also, incidentally, been film footage released of Russian bombing of the small town of Belitska, which is located to the north of Rodinska. And this also was used for a time by the Ukrainians. This small town was also used by the Ukrainians as a base area in order to launch the various attacks that the Ukrainians made, in order both to recapture Rodinska itself, but also to cut off the Russians in places like Kucherov Yar and Zoloty Kolodyaz and those places. And, well, it was, I have to say this, the video footage of Belitska was an absolute lunar landscape. This town has been blasted out of non-existence, and you could see the exploding bombs, the fab bombs with enormous flashes of light. It was something out of a vision of Milton's hell. Just to say, one feels, at least I feel, desperately sorry for any Ukrainian soldiers who find themselves there. I wonder how many there still are, and I cannot imagine that this small town is going to remain under Ukrainian control for much longer. Once the Russians have finished with Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, now that they appear also to have finished with Vladimirovka and Sharkovo just nearby, the Ukrainians have all but admitted the loss of Sharkovo. I expect that the Russians will advance north and capture this place too. Anyway, that's part of the battle that's taking place. But the Russian Defense Ministry has more to say, and they're talking about the situation now in Mirnograd, where, in my opinion, the bulk of the Ukrainian troops, the trapped Ukrainian troops, are. They say that in Mirnograd, units of the 51st Army continue to advance in the Vostochny neighborhood and the southern part of the town. Assault detachments of the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade approached the Zapadny neighborhood, and the Russian Defense Ministry is highlighting the fact that the Russians are approaching the Zapadny neighborhood, and then for the first time in a long time, the Russians are giving us information about the number of troops or buildings that the Russians have, as they say, liberated in Mirnograd. They say that it amounts to 33 buildings. So it looks as if, or so it seems to me, as if the situation in Mirnograd is now accelerating, and that after a pause, perhaps to allow the Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd time to consider offers to surrender, it looks as if the Russians are now busy, have now made a decision to sort out the battle of Mirnograd and to bring this battle in Mirnograd to an end and to extinguish this Ukrainian grouping, this trapped Ukrainian grouping, which is still located there. So I would interpret this latest report from the Russian Defense Ministry as saying that the Russian forces have now been given the green light to complete the mopping up operation, in which case we are indeed now at the brink of the end. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. There is a whole new narrative about the Battle of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, which is now beginning to take hold. I saw that it was repeated by people like Mark Galeotti, for example, in the Times, but you find it in all sorts of places. The reason Pokrovsk has fallen so fast, the major reason why the Russians have achieved this extraordinary breakthrough is fog, apparently. There is indeed heavy fog over many days in and around many of these places that have been fought over along the front lines. The Ukrainian drones are blinded by the fog that enables the Russians to infiltrate Ukrainian positions. They've been able to capture Pokrovsk because the Ukrainians were blinded by the fog, and it is the fog that explains the imminent fall of Pokrovsk and Russia's victory. Well, I overstate the way these people put it. But anyway, I'm tired about reading about the fog. The fog, of course, is there. It does exist. It no doubt plays a role in the battle, as, well, very hot and dry weather also does, as mud also does. The mud, for example, in the Rasputitsa would be expected to slow the attacker, but nobody has talked about that in relation to the Russian offensive. The very hot, dry weather in the summer ought to have slowed the Russians too, but it doesn't seem to have done so. And to repeat again, the reason there is this so much emphasis on the fog is that the people who write this are operating under a totally false chronology. They're still taking far too much of their information from what the Ukrainians are saying. They still act as if the Russian breakthrough deep into Pokrovsk was only achieved over the last 2 weeks, whereas the Russians managed to enter Pokrovsk and expand their presence inside Pokrovsk back in August, well before the fog became a problem. And it was in August and early September that the breakthrough in Pokrovsk came, when, as I said, there was no issue or problem about fog. The Ukrainians were not admitting to those realities then, but there was video footage which eventually confirmed it. And of course, this information about the Russian breakthroughs in Pokrovsk at that time was confirmed also at that time, not just by Russian commentators, but by the many excellent neutral commentators, Suryak and the others, who describe the situation every day on the battlefronts. It still amazes me how so many people writing in the media in the West, but also in parts of social media as well, cling to the belief that everything that the Ukrainians say must be true and everything that the Russians say must be false, and come up with all sorts of elaborate reasons to reconcile what they believe is the true information the Ukrainians have been giving them with the sudden realities on the front lines as these develop. Anyway, I'm not going to waste more time on that. Just to say that whilst the fog has played a role, the weather always plays a role. The weather and the topography are always a constant in every battle. While the fog has played its part, it is not the reason, ultimately, why the Russians are winning this battle. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry also has a fair amount to say about the situation in Kupiansk. They say that assault detachments of the 6th Army continue to eliminate encircled Ukrainian formations near Kupiansk. Notice that they now say increasingly that the Ukrainian formations are near Kupiansk. Kupiansk itself, it seems to me, is essentially under Russian control. And they also say that over the past 24 hours, 2 attacks launched by units of the 151st Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army and the 1st National Guard Brigade to release the encircled Ukrainian troops were repelled near Osinovo and Zaporozhye. The Ukrainian losses amounted to 10 troops and 1 pickup truck, which does not suggest very strong attempts by the Ukrainians to reverse the situation in Kupiansk. I mentioned that there were claims that Syrskyi has deployed 10,000 troops to the Pokrovsk area. There are the same claims that he's deployed 10,000 troops to the Kupiansk area as well, and another 10,000 troops to contain the breakthrough near Pavlograd. I don't believe this. I think that would mean that 30,000 Ukrainian troops have been drawn from the Ukrainian reserves to contain these Russian breakthroughs. I don't believe that Ukraine can do that now. I think that perhaps Syrskyi has indeed deployed 10,000 men to one specific area. I do believe that that is near Pokrovsk, where probably he still worries, and Zelensky still worries, that the worst Russian breakthrough, the most dangerous Russian breakthrough, is to come. I think people are multiplying that force of 10,000 by 3, which is hardly surprising. To repeat again, we are looking here at an emerging catastrophe, what Medvedev referred to as the collapse of the front lines. A Ukrainian commentator, a Ukrainian MP to be precise, who is actually an MP, said that there are now as many people absent without leave from the Ukrainian army as there are actually troops on the front lines. That is a staggering claim. I don't know what information this MP has to validate that. Maybe he is exaggerating, but it would not surprise me if it is true. I don't get the sense that Ukrainian soldiers are yet inclined to surrender to the Russian army. There is still strong resistance within Ukraine, within Ukrainian society, to doing that. What they appear to be doing instead, and this seems to go beyond recently mobilized soldiers, even some of the hardened veterans, is that they're quietly giving up and leaving their units and trying perhaps in some way to get home, or at least to get away from the battle. Those of us who have studied the history of the American Civil War of the 1860s would know that something very similar began to happen towards the end of the conflict, in the last few months of the conflict, to the armies of the South. Those armies did indeed suffer extremely heavy losses in the battle. Southern troops, however, still were unwilling to surrender outright to the Union army without receiving specific instructions to do so from their commanders. But increasingly, as it became obvious that the cause of the Confederacy was lost, more and more of them began quietly to drift away. And all of this happened, incidentally, as funding for the Confederate government dried up, and as the Confederate currency began to break down and eventually fall into a condition of spiraling inflation. I've said in the past that the conflict for which to me the conflict in Ukraine most resembles is the one between North and South during the American Civil War. Perhaps I overdraw the parallels at times, if only because it is one of the few wars that I have studied with any great attention. But I have to say, with every month that passes, the parallels begin to grow clearer and more obvious to me. Well, there are reports now in Kiev that after having ruled out negotiations, President Zelensky and his officials are trying in some way now to restart them. A couple of days ago, a deputy foreign minister of Ukraine, one of the participants in the Istanbul negotiations, the various Istanbul talks that have taken place over the course of this year between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Anyway, this deputy foreign minister gave an interview to the London Times, over the course of which he said that the talks between Russia and Ukraine had been suspended until the end of the year because the Russians were not interested in negotiating a ceasefire. I've discussed this interview in an earlier program. I pointed out that this deputy foreign minister actually didn't disclose anything that we didn't already know. Zelensky was never happy with the Istanbul format of the negotiations. Ever since the Anchorage summit meeting, he has been trying to get the Americans to agree, and the Russians to agree, to a bilateral summit meeting between himself and Vladimir Putin. Actually, he tried to get such a bilateral meeting set up back in May, after Putin said that he would send negotiators to meet with the Ukrainians in Istanbul. And Zelensky, at that point, as I remember, tried to organize a bilateral meeting between Putin and himself, and that was absurd, and Trump wasn't happy, and Erdogan talked Zelensky out of it, and eventually, and very reluctantly, Zelensky sent negotiators to meet with the Russians in Istanbul. But he's never been happy with this format of the negotiations, and after the Anchorage meeting between Putin and Trump, he again tried to get a bilateral meeting between Putin and himself, and indeed even a trilateral meeting between Putin and himself, but one involving Trump also. And the Russians have never accepted this, and they instead insisted that the talks must take place between proper delegations, between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul. And there have been 3 meetings between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul, but there's been no actual movement, no real movement yet towards a substantive agreement. What there has been is agreements for exchanges of prisoners, and the Russians, of course, have also at various times offered to return to Ukraine the remains of Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainians have never been enthusiastic about accepting that either, but eventually they have always done so. So anyway, when that deputy foreign minister said that the talks had been suspended, what he was telling us was something that was obvious to anybody who has followed the diplomacy. Zelensky has never been keen on this format. He's never liked it. The Russians had proposed an upgrading of the delegations, more senior negotiators to be appointed. They also suggested that three working parties be established to discuss particular details of the settlement process. Zelensky has never at any point agreed to anything like that. He has never, as I pointed out on many occasions, even rescinded his own decree from October 2022, which actually prohibits negotiations by any Ukrainian official with the Russians at all. So what the Deputy Foreign Minister said was really completely unoriginal. The only thing that I found interesting about that interview was this Deputy Foreign Minister's admission that the Russians had researched and done background checks on each Ukrainian delegate and knew their entire backstory. That I did find interesting as providing evidence of the extremely careful preparation the Russians always make before engaging in substantive negotiations of this type. Anyway, now it seems that Zelensky is suddenly rediscovering, I won't say an enthusiasm, but at least an interest in some further meetings with the Russians. And he has contacted the Turks, and Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan is again saying that we're close to some kind of compromise peace, some negotiated final settlement. And Zelensky is saying that Rustem Umerov, the former Ukrainian defense minister, who is now secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, and who was told to leave Ukraine in a hurry before the NABU investigators closed in on him and perhaps arrested him and started to ask him serious questions. Anyway, this person, who is, by the way, the head of Ukraine's negotiating team, has now been told, apparently, to reopen talks with the Russians about getting some kind of prisoner exchange organized. In my opinion, no one should place too much weight on any of this. It looks to me like an exercise in buying time. Buying time in terms of the evolving investigation, corruption investigation in Kiev. Zelensky has to provide some reason why Umerov is not in Kiev answering questions of the investigators. So what more convincing excuse can one find than to say, well, Umerov is needed to talk to the Russians and to try to get our boys back from Russian captivity. And of course, buy time by trying to persuade the Russians again to agree to some sort of pause or freeze on the conflict lines. And the only way to do that, of course, even theoretically, is by talking to them. So this is what this exercise is all about. The fact that Zelensky has suddenly rediscovered an interest in doing this just days after his deputy foreign minister said that all talks with the Russians were suspended until the end of the year, is a further sign of how bad the situation is, the extent to which the situation on the conflict lines is going from bad to worse. The critical situation with the energy system and the war in the sky, the worries about the financing by the West, and the tremors in Kiev that is causing with the corruption investigations and all of that. Even Zelensky's former patron, Igor Kolomoisky, the profoundly corrupt Ukrainian oligarch who is in prison in Ukraine serving a sentence. Even he has now resurfaced and is putting out messages about how the writing is now on the wall for Zelensky and perhaps others, and potentially even maybe for Ukraine itself. To repeat again, I don't see any real sign here of any genuine step to turn the situation round, to try to begin substantive negotiations. And, well, if Guiliapole falls, alongside Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Novopavlivka, Velikomikhailovka, Seversk, where there's been a lot more news, by the way, which I haven't covered on this program, Liman, which our old friend Andrei Marochko said the attack is beginning against, Stepnogorsk, which the Russian reporter, Marat Khairulin, says that the Russians are now close to approaching. Anyway, when the collapse comes, many people in Moscow will probably say to themselves, what is the left to negotiate about at all at this stage? We have seen what Zelensky and the political class in Kiev are like. Maybe talking to the Ukrainians is still in our interests, but Istanbul plus the proposals we made back on the 14th of June 2024 have now been completely overtaken by events. We're already, well, maybe not in control of Donbass, but very close to achieving it. And perhaps Zaporozhye region too. And the Ukrainian army is perhaps not quite so far from collapse. And perhaps there are problems with Ukraine's financial viability as well. Maybe the right thing to do is not to propose or agree to negotiations for peace, but to do that which some Russian officials, to my knowledge, have increasingly been thinking about. To demand instead Ukraine's surrender. To negotiate not terms for a settlement, but terms of surrender. Anyway, we'll see if I'm right. There's still a long way to go and a lot to do, but the pace of events, or so it seems to me, is quickening. That's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can please remember to check out our new Substack, site, the Duran on Substack. All our videos and some articles that I and others are now writing can be found there. And also, please remember to check out our shop, and if you want to support our work, go to Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.